Long before Europeans drew lines on maps, the vast collection of islands now known as Indonesia was a vibrant and complex world of its own. It was a place of hundreds of languages, diverse cultures, and powerful kingdoms. This sprawling archipelago, stretching across the equator like a string of emeralds, held a treasure that would change the course of global history. This treasure was not gold or silver, but something far more valuable in the kitchens and apothecaries of the 16th and 17th centuries: spices. Cloves, nutmeg, and mace grew exclusively in a small group of islands here, known as the Spice Islands or the Moluccas. These aromatic commodities were worth more than their weight in gold in Europe, driving a global trade network that connected Asia, Africa, and Europe. The allure of these spices was, honestly, just irresistible. European powers, fresh from the age of discovery, were desperate to control the source of this incredible wealth. They wanted to cut out the Arab, Venetian, and Portuguese middlemen who controlled the long and perilous trade routes. The nation that could seize control of the Spice Islands would not only become immensely rich but would also wield significant global power. This economic desire was the primary reason the Dutch set their sights on the archipelago. They were not just explorers or traders, they were entrepreneurs with a mission to dominate the most lucrative market on the planet, and they were prepared to do whatever it took to achieve that goal. For the people of the Indonesian islands, trade was a familiar way of life. They had been trading for centuries with merchants from China, India, and the Arabian Peninsula, creating a dynamic exchange of goods, ideas, and cultures. These interactions were largely based on mutual benefit and established trading relationships. The arrival of the Europeans, however, introduced a new and aggressive dynamic. The Dutch, in particular, were not interested in becoming just another trading partner. They sought a monopoly, which means they wanted exclusive control over the entire spice trade. This ambition put them on a direct collision course with the local rulers and populations who had cultivated and traded these spices for generations. This fundamental conflict between the Dutch desire for a complete monopoly and the islanders' established way of life set the stage for centuries of violence. The Dutch did not see the local populations as partners, but as obstacles to their commercial ambitions. To secure their profits, they would need to enforce their will, crush any and all resistance, and dismantle the existing social and economic structures. The story of Dutch expansion in Indonesia is therefore not just a story of trade and economics. It is a dark history of conquest, subjugation, and the systematic use of brutal force to bend an entire archipelago to the will of a distant European power, leaving a legacy of trauma that would last for centuries. The Dutch instrument for this ambitious and violent project was the Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie, or VOC. Known in English as the Dutch East India Company, it was founded in 1602. On the surface, the VOC was a trading company, a revolutionary new business model where ordinary citizens could buy shares and profit from its ventures. It was in many ways the world's first multinational corporation. However, the VOC was granted extraordinary powers by the Dutch government. It could negotiate treaties, build fortresses, maintain its own armies and navies, and even wage war. It was a company that acted like a state, blending commercial interests with military might in a way the world had never seen before. The VOC's primary objective was simple: to secure a total monopoly on the spice trade. To do this, it had to eliminate its European rivals, primarily the English and the Portuguese, and completely control the local producers. The company's leaders in Amsterdam and its governors-general in Asia, like the infamous Jan Pieterszoon Cohen, believed that trade could not exist without war, and war could not be funded without trade. This philosophy became the guiding principle of VOC operations. They did not arrive in the archipelago as peaceful merchants seeking fair deals. They arrived as conquerors with cannons and muskets, ready to impose their terms through intimidation and violence. The methods used by the VOC were ruthless and systematic. When a local ruler refused to sign an exclusive contract to sell spices only to the Dutch, the company would respond with overwhelming force. Their ships would blockade ports, their soldiers would burn villages, and their leaders would depose uncooperative rulers, replacing them with more compliant puppets. The VOC also practiced a brutal policy known as extirpatio, which involved the deliberate destruction of clove and nutmeg trees on islands they could not fully control. This was done to limit the supply of spices, drive up prices, and ensure that no one else could profit from them. It was a scorched earth policy that destroyed local economies and livelihoods. This strategy of violence was applied across the archipelago. The VOC established a central headquarters in Batavia, which is modern-day Jakarta on the island of Java, building a fortified city from which it could project its power. From Batavia, the company launched military campaigns to subdue kingdoms in Sulawesi, Sumatra, and most importantly, the Spice Islands themselves. They intervened in local succession disputes, backing one claimant over another in exchange for trade concessions and territory. In this way, the VOC slowly but surely entangled itself in the political fabric of the islands, using a divide-and-conquer strategy to weaken powerful local kingdoms and bring them under Dutch influence, all backed by the constant threat of military annihilation. The island of Ambon, along with the nearby Banda Islands, was the epicenter of the world's nutmeg and mace supply, making it a primary target for the VOC. When the Dutch first arrived, the Ambonese people had a long-standing trading relationship with other Asian merchants and, more recently, with the Portuguese and the English. They were not willing to simply hand over their entire economic future to the Dutch. The Ambonese resisted the VOC's demands for an exclusive contract, continuing to trade with whoever offered the best price. This defiance was something the VOC could not tolerate, as it directly challenged their goal of a complete monopoly. The stage was set for a brutal confrontation. The VOC's response was swift and merciless. Under the command of figures like Governor General Cohen, the Dutch launched a series of violent campaigns to subjugate the islands. This was not a war between two evenly matched armies. It was a campaign of terror waged against the civilian population. VOC soldiers and mercenaries landed on the islands and systematically destroyed villages, executed local leaders, and enslaved the population. The most infamous of these acts was the conquest of the Banda Islands in 1621. Cohen's forces massacred almost the entire population, estimated at around 15,000 people. The few who survived were either enslaved or fled to other islands. Once the original inhabitants were gone, the VOC repopulated the islands with enslaved people brought from other parts of the archipelago and Dutch colonists, known as percaniers. These colonists were given parcels of land to manage nutmeg plantations, but they were forced to sell their entire harvest to the VOC at a fixed low price. The company had effectively transformed the islands into a massive, privately owned plantation run on slave labor. This brutal system ensured that the VOC had absolute control over every single nutmeg and piece of mace produced. The vibrant society that had once thrived in the Banda Islands was erased and replaced by a cruel and exploitative colonial machine. The events in Ambon and Banda sent a chilling message across the entire Indonesian archipelago. It demonstrated that the VOC was not just another trading partner, it was a ruthless power that would stop at nothing to achieve its economic goals. The destruction of the Bandanese people became a symbol of Dutch brutality and a warning to any other community that dared to defy the company's authority. The immense profits that flowed back to Amsterdam from the spice monopoly were built upon a foundation of mass murder, enslavement, and the complete destruction of an indigenous society. The sweet scent of nutmeg in European kitchens carried with it the stench of unimaginable violence. Amidst the VOC's violent conquest of the spice trade, another conflict was simmering: the intense rivalry with the English East India Company. Both companies were competing for the same prize, and their relationship was marked by suspicion and hostility. In 1623, on the island of Ambon, these tensions erupted in an incident that would become known as the Amboina Massacre. The Dutch controlled the main fortress on the island, Fort Victoria, but a small English trading post was permitted to operate nearby. The local Dutch governor, Herman van Spalt, was deeply paranoid about a potential English plot to seize the fort and overthrow Dutch rule. This paranoia led to a tragic series of events. A Japanese mercenary in Dutch service was caught allegedly spying on the fort's defenses. Under torture, he confessed to being part of a conspiracy involving the English traders. Based on this forced confession, the Dutch authorities arrested Gabriel Towerson, the head of the English trading post, and his men. They were systematically and brutally tortured to extract further confessions. The methods used were horrific, including waterboarding and burning with candles. Unsurprisingly, under such extreme duress, the men confessed to a plot that most historians now agree never existed. It was a fabrication born from the governor's fear and the company's ruthless culture. On March 9, 1623, 10 Englishmen, 10 Japanese mercenaries, and 1 Portuguese man were publicly executed in the courtyard of Fort Victoria. They were beheaded, and their heads were displayed on poles as a warning. The event caused outrage in England, where it was portrayed as a barbaric and treacherous act by the Dutch. Pamphlets and plays were written about the massacre, fueling anti-Dutch sentiment that would persist for decades and contribute to the Anglo-Dutch wars that followed. For the English, it was a symbol of Dutch cruelty and a justification for future hostilities against their commercial rivals. The incident effectively ended the English presence in the Spice Islands for a long time. The significance of the Amboina massacre was twofold. Firstly, it solidified the VOC's absolute control over the highly profitable Spice Islands. By brutally eliminating their main European competitor from the region, the Dutch secured their monopoly without challenge for nearly 2 centuries. Secondly, it starkly revealed the nature of the VOC's power. The company operated with its own legal system, far from the oversight of its home government. Its officials could act as judge, jury, and executioner, using torture and summary executions to enforce their authority. The massacre was a clear demonstration that in the pursuit of profit, the VOC recognized no moral or legal boundaries, a reality the people of Indonesia already knew all too well. As the VOC's power grew, its influence spread from the Spice Islands to the most populous and politically significant island in the archipelago Java. For centuries, Java was home to powerful Islamic sultanates, most notably the Mataram Sultanate. Through a combination of military pressure and political manipulation, the Dutch had gradually eroded Mataram's sovereignty, forcing its rulers to cede territory and grant economic concessions. By the early 19th century, after the VOC went bankrupt and its territories were taken over by the Dutch government, this colonial interference had become deeply resented by the Javanese aristocracy and common people alike. This simmering resentment boiled over in 1825 with the outbreak of the Java War, one of the largest and bloodiest anti-colonial struggles in Indonesian history. The war was led by Prince Diponegoro, a charismatic and devout member of the Yogyakarta royal family. Diponegoro was honestly disgusted by the growing Dutch influence at court and the moral decay he saw among the Dutch-backed Javanese elite. The final trigger for the rebellion was a Dutch decision to build a road across a piece of his land that contained a sacred family tomb. He called for a holy war or jihad against the Dutch, and his call resonated deeply with the Javanese population, who were suffering under heavy taxes and forced labor. The Java War lasted for 5 devastating years, from 1825 to 1830. It was not a simple conflict but a massive guerrilla war that engulfed central Java. Prince Diponegoro's forces, a mix of peasants, aristocrats, and religious leaders, used hit-and-run tactics, melting into the countryside and enjoying widespread popular support. The Dutch, despite their superior weaponry, found it incredibly difficult to pin down and defeat the rebels. The war was immensely costly for the Dutch, both in terms of money and manpower. It drained the colonial treasury and required the deployment of thousands of European and local auxiliary troops to suppress the uprising. Ultimately, the Dutch prevailed not through superior strategy on the battlefield, but through a combination of attrition and, honestly, treachery. They implemented a fortress system, building a network of small, well-garrisoned forts across the countryside to restrict the rebels' movement and cut them off from their supplies. Finally, in 1830, the Dutch lured Prince Diponegoro to a meeting under the false pretense of peace negotiations. When he arrived, he was betrayed, arrested, and exiled to Sulawesi, where he remained until his death. The war resulted in the deaths of an estimated 200,000 Javanese people and completely shattered the power of the Mataram Sultanate, allowing the Dutch to annex most of its remaining territory and cement their control over Java. While the Dutch managed to subdue Java, another major challenge to their authority lay at the northern tip of Sumatra, the powerful and fiercely independent Sultanate of Aceh. For centuries, Aceh had been a major trading and religious center, with strong international connections. Its people were renowned for their martial prowess and their deep commitment to Islam. The Dutch had long coveted Aceh's strategic location on the Malacca Strait and its rich resources, particularly pepper and later oil. As long as Aceh remained independent, It posed a threat to the Dutch ambition of controlling the entire archipelago, which they now called the Dutch East Indies. In 1873, the Dutch launched a full-scale invasion of Aceh, expecting a quick and easy victory. They were disastrously wrong. The first Dutch expedition was a humiliating failure, with their commander being killed in an assault on the Grand Mosque of the capital. This initial defeat marked the beginning of the Aceh War, a brutal and protracted conflict that would last for over 3 decades, with continued resistance flaring up until the eve of World War II. The Acehnese waged a relentless guerrilla war against the invaders, fueled by a powerful combination of patriotism and religious fervor. They saw the fight against the Dutch infidels as a sacred duty. Faced with such determined resistance, the Dutch military adopted increasingly ruthless tactics. They employed a counterinsurgency strategy that targeted not just the Acehnese fighters but the entire civilian population that supported them. Under the command of General Johannes van Hoyts, the Dutch Marechaussee, a special corps of military police, carried out so-called pacification campaigns. These campaigns involved burning villages, destroying crops, and conducting summary executions of anyone suspected of aiding the resistance. The Dutch strategy was to create so much terror and suffering among the civilian population that they would no longer be willing or able to support the guerrillas. The Aceh War was one of the longest and costliest colonial wars in modern history. It is estimated that over 100,000 Acehnese people, soldiers and civilians, were killed, alongside thousands of Dutch and colonial troops. Although the Dutch eventually managed to kill or capture most of the Acehnese leadership and declare the war over in the early 20th century, they never truly broke the spirit of resistance. The war left deep scars on Acehnese society and became a powerful symbol of the brutal price of Dutch colonialism. The memory of this long and bloody struggle would fuel a strong sense of regional identity and a desire for independence that continues to shape the region to this day. Even after centuries of colonial rule, the Dutch grip on the vast archipelago was not absolute. Following the end of World War II and the Indonesian Declaration of Independence in August 1945, a fierce struggle for freedom erupted across the islands. The Dutch, determined to reclaim their prized colony, returned with military force. In the region of South Sulawesi, a strong pro-independence movement had emerged, with local youths and guerrilla fighters challenging the reimposition of Dutch authority. To crush this resistance, the Dutch military resorted to the same brutal methods that had defined its history in the archipelago. This campaign of suppression, which took place from late 1946 to early 1947, is known in Indonesia as the Pembantaian Westerling, or the Westerling Massacre. It was named after Captain Raymond Westerling, the commander of a special forces unit called the Depot Special Troepen, or DST. Westerling was tasked with pacifying South Sulawesi and eliminating the independence movement. He implemented a method of counterinsurgency that relied on public terror. His troops would surround a village, round up all the men, and then, often with the help of masked informants, publicly execute those accused of being rebels or sympathizers in front of their families and neighbors. The goal of Westerling's methods was not just to eliminate guerrilla fighters, but to terrorize the entire population into submission. By carrying out arbitrary and public executions, he created an atmosphere of intense fear, making people terrified to offer any form of support, food, shelter, or information, to the independence fighters. These summary executions were carried out without trial or any legal process. People were shot on the spot based on accusations alone. This brutal campaign moved from village to village, leaving a trail of death and trauma. The official Dutch death toll was around 600, but Indonesian sources claim the number of victims was far higher, possibly reaching into the thousands. The South Sulawesi campaign is a stark example of how the patterns of violence established by the VOC continued into the 20th century. The tactics of collective punishment, summary executions, and terrorizing civilian populations were not new. They were a continuation of the strategies used in Banda, Java, and Aceh. The campaign was intended to break the will of the Indonesian people and demonstrate that the Dutch were prepared to use extreme violence to maintain their colonial empire. However, like the atrocities of the past, these acts of brutality only strengthened the resolve of the independence movement and deepened the Indonesian people's desire to be free from foreign rule. The Dutch colonial empire, which had seemed so powerful for so long, proved to be surprisingly fragile. In early 1942, during World War II, the Empire of Japan launched a swift and devastating invasion of the Dutch East Indies. The Japanese were seeking to secure the region's vital resources, especially oil, to fuel their war machine. The Dutch colonial army, the KNIL, was ill-prepared and quickly overwhelmed. The myth of European superiority, which had been a cornerstone of colonial rule, was shattered in a matter of weeks as Dutch forces were defeated across the archipelago. One of the key battles took place on the island of Ambon in late January and early February 1942. Ambon was strategically important due to its excellent harbor and airfield. It was defended by a combined force of Dutch and Australian troops, known as Gulf Force. The Japanese invasion force was far superior in numbers and equipment. After several days of intense fighting, the Allied defenders were forced to surrender. What followed was a grim chapter of wartime atrocities. The Japanese, seeking to secure the island quickly, showed little mercy to their captives. Immediately following the surrender, Japanese troops carried out a series of mass executions. Over 300 surrendered Dutch and Australian prisoners of war were taken to Laha airfield and summarily executed. They were killed by bayonet or beheaded. This event, known as the Laha Massacre, was a horrific war crime. For the prisoners who survived the initial massacres, their ordeal was far from over. They were interned in brutal prison camps on Ambon and the nearby island of Hainan, where they suffered from starvation, disease, and forced labor. By the end of the war, more than two-thirds of the Australian prisoners of war captured on Ambon had died in captivity. The Japanese victory and the subsequent brutal occupation had a profound impact. It demonstrated to the Indonesian people that the Dutch were not invincible. While the Japanese occupation was itself incredibly harsh, it broke the continuity of Dutch rule and in some ways, inadvertently paved the way for independence. The Japanese also armed and trained Indonesian youth groups to support their war effort, giving future independence fighters valuable military experience. The fall of Ambon and the massacre of Allied prisoners of war was a brutal episode within a larger global conflict, but it also served as the final death blow to the prestige and power of the Dutch colonial state. The long and dark history of Dutch expansion in Indonesia, from the first VOC ships to the final colonial wars, is a story defined by a consistent pattern of violence. Whether it was the massacres in the Banda Islands in the 17th century, the brutal suppression of the Java and Aceh wars in the 19th century, or the counterinsurgency campaigns after World War II, the goal was always the same: to establish and maintain control through force. The methods were remarkably consistent over time. Overwhelming military power, collective punishment of civilian populations, summary executions, and the use of terror as a tool of governance. This was not random violence. It was a systematic strategy employed to crush resistance and exploit the archipelago's resources. This centuries-long experience of subjugation left deep and lasting trauma on Indonesian society. The violence was not just physical, it was psychological, social, and economic. It destroyed communities, shattered traditional political structures, and replaced them with a colonial hierarchy based on race and exploitation. The memory of these brutal events was passed down through generations, creating a collective consciousness of suffering and injustice. The stories of Diponegro's rebellion, the heroic resistance in Aceh, and the massacres in South Sulawesi became part of the national narrative, powerful symbols of the struggle against foreign domination. This shared history of suffering and resistance became the fertile ground in which the seeds of modern Indonesian nationalism grew. The desire for merdeka, or freedom, was not an abstract political idea. It was a deeply felt, emotional response to centuries of oppression. The leaders of the independence movement, like Sukarno and Hatta, were able to unite the diverse peoples of the archipelago by appealing to this common experience. They argued that despite their different languages and cultures, all Indonesians were bound together by their shared struggle against the same colonial master. The brutal actions of the Dutch, intended to divide and conquer, ultimately had the opposite effect. They helped forge a unified national identity. In the end, the very violence that the Dutch used to build and maintain their empire became the cause of its downfall. It created an unbreakable will to be free. The Indonesian Declaration of Independence in 1945 was not just a political document, it was the culmination of centuries of resistance against a system built on conquest and brutality. The subsequent four-year war for independence was the final bloody chapter in this long struggle. The legacy of this dark history is complex, shaping Indonesia's national identity, its politics, and its relationship with the world. It stands as a powerful reminder that empires built on violence will eventually face a reckoning, and that the human desire for freedom is a force that cannot be extinguished forever.